Radiation is a topic that we've discussed in different forms on this channel. It's a subject that continues to interest me because it can cause so many advancements in an ever-evolving society and yet cause so much pain and destruction. Invisible to the human eye, radiation is the subject of science fiction and horror, but true stories can be much more terrifying. We've discussed the effects of radiation on an entire city, but let's narrow it down. We've talked about how people can die of radiation poisoning. Let's focus on that. Today, we're going to talk about what happened to one man as he suffered through 83 days of radiation sickness. Hisashi Ouchi was a 35-year-old worker at the JCO Tokamura power plant, arriving to work on time at 7 o'clock, September 30th, 1999. Ouchi was a punctual man with a daily routine, and this should have been like any other day. At 10 a.m., he began his task in the conversion test building, which was to process uranium fuel for a new experimental fast reactor called JOYO. Ouchi, a colleague, and his boss had been working on the project since September 10th, and it was now in its final phase. Following his boss's orders, Ouchi first filtered a uranium solution that had been melted into a stainless steel bucket using a filter called Nucho. His boss and colleague then poured the filtered solution into a large container called a precipitation tank. His boss then held a funnel in place while Ouchi and his colleague poured the filtered uranium into it from a stainless steel beaker. Once filtration was complete, Ouchi relieved his boss, taking the funnel for him. The three were on their seventh bucket when the colleague was pouring the last of the uranium, but the container couldn't hold that much uranium, and the three didn't know this. Suddenly, there was a crack, and a blue light, known as the Cherenkov light, emitted when criticality is reached. Criticality is the state in which a mass of fissionable material sustained or is able to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. The process releases a high intensity of neuron beams, which converts sodium in the human body into a radioactive substance called sodium-24. At that instance, neuron beams pierced through their bodies. At 10:30 a.m., the area monitor's siren went off, alerting everybody of a radiation leak. The boss, who was now in another room, yelled, "Run for your lives." Ouchi took refuge in a changing room just outside the radioactive supervision area, where he began to vomit and lost consciousness. By 10 a.m. on October 1st, the criticality accident had been contained, but for the three workers who'd been exposed, the nightmare was just beginning. Ouchi was unfortunately the one who absorbed the most radiation, estimated to have received 20 times the amount of lethal radiation a human body can withstand within a year. As soon as he arrived at the medical center, a blood test was taken, and it was already discovered that his white blood cell count was very low and not producing any new ones. The first thing radiation does when it attacks the human body is prevent new blood cells from forming. A lack of white blood cells can affect our immunity, intestinal mucous membrane, and skin. The decrease allows us to become easily infected with viruses, bacteria, and mold. It basically takes away our armor. Despite this news, Ouchi didn't seem to be in critical condition. He was awake and alert, with some slight swelling in the face and redness, but he didn't have any peeling or blistering like everybody had expected. He was answering questions in an honest and stable manner, and despite being the one with the worst radiation, he had the most emotional stability of the three workers. Professor Kazuhiko Makawa, who had taken it upon himself to look over Ouchi, was convinced that he could save the man's life, despite every specialist telling him that there was nothing science could do. The professor's optimism was comforting, but by day 2, Ouchi was already starting to show signs of deterioration. Oxygen in his blood had decreased, and he had to be put on inhalation and other treatments to correct it. There was also some swelling in his abdomen, perhaps from damage to his intestines. But Makawa refused to give up his optimism and continued to seek treatment. Ouchi was transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital on the third day. Staff didn't know what to expect when he arrived, fearing that they'd be exposed to secondhand radiation since all they knew was what the news coverage told them about the horrific radiation accident. Keep in mind, Japan had never dealt with a radiation accident like this before. They were surprised when Ouchi arrived since he was so alert and aware. He stated, "I'm grateful that you're looking after me." Most nurses remember Ouchi as a kind, light-hearted person. By day 5, they were still able to have full conversations with him, solidifying the idea that he could one day walk out of the ICU cured. By day 7, micrographs of Ouchi's bone marrow was received, and the discovery of his shattered body continued to grow. They saw his chromosomes, the blueprints of life, shattered and fused to each other in strange ways. Because he was so vulnerable to disease with the decreased white blood cell count, Ouchi had to be constantly monitored with blood tests and a sterilized room. On day 7, the hospital discovered a drop in his platelets, which stopped bleeding, so they implemented a platelet transfusion while they waited for his main treatment to begin. The treatment they were after was called hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. Sorry if I butchered that, which would ideally allow him to produce cells again. The procedure required a blood donor, and fortunately, Ouchi's sister was a perfect match. She stated, "Take as much blood as you need to save my brother. Please, do everything you can for him." The extraction took place over 2 days, and each session took 4.5 hours. It would take 10 days to know if Ouchi's body had accepted the new cells. Ouchi's family was by his side since day 1. With daily reports from Makawa, they were kept informed as to every step of the procedure, even told what to expect when deterioration started to take place. Ouchi's doctors were optimistic but realistic, and they knew that the worst was yet to come. Ouchi's family was very understanding, and the physicians were moved by their closeness. By day 11, Ouchi was starting to show subtle changes. He had a daily routine of extracting bone marrow and constant monitoring. It was starting to make him fatigued. But even through all of his tiredness, he stated that he knew others were working hard to keep him safe, and he shouldn't complain. The staff named him Cheerful Mr. Ouchi, and they were astonished that after all he had been through, he was still more concerned about others. Visible changes began to occur that day. As medical tape was removed from Ouchi's chest, it took a little bit of skin with it and would leave permanent marks. The medical staff was then forbidden to use that kind of medical tape on Ouchi again. Just like after a burn, blisters began to form on Ouchi's right hand because it was the hand closest to the radiation holding the funnel. When his feet were washed as well, the skin started to come off when they were dried. In a healthy person, skin cells on the surface divide and die all the time. We have to rely on skin cells reforming from deeper layers being pushed to the surface in order to continue the cycle of dying and replenishing cells. In Ouchi's case, since he didn't have any new cells forming, the skin cells would just die, and his skin started to disappear with it. The experience was very painful to Ouchi, and on top of that, his breathing had started to deteriorate due to an unknown shadow found in his lungs through X-rays. His breathing had been an uphill battle for a while, but by day 12, the decision had to be made to insert a breathing tube in order to stop his blood pressure from falling too low. Makawa was confident that one day they would be able to remove it, but unfortunately, that day never came, and Ouchi was forevermore silenced. The deterioration of his skin was fast and horrifying by day 16. Most of the skin on the arms and front of his body was starting to fall away, since that's what was facing the radiation when it happened. No longer able to take in food by mouth, thanks to the breathing tube, he had to have a tube inserted from his nose to his stomach in order to give him nutrition. However, seeing it leave his body left them concerned that he wasn't processing any food given to him this way, and the method had to be abandoned. By day 18, there was a spark of hope, when all of a sudden Ouchi's white blood cell count rapidly increased. It seemed that his sister's donation was to thank for it. However, Ouchi was still in a great deal of pain and had to be sedated most of the time in order to deal with it. Nurses played music in his room to keep him calm, but they were never really sure if he could even hear it. They think mostly it was to help keep themselves calm. However, that spark of hope was quickly dashed by day 26 when reports came in stating that the sister's donated cells were also being damaged by Ouchi's body, much like his own were. Radioactive particles left in Ouchi's body was destroying everything in its path, including anything introduced to him. On day 27, intestinal issues began to rise, as out of nowhere Ouchi started to have diarrhea, which was Makawa's worst fear. Fear amplified after an examination discovered that layers of Ouchi's intestine were now disappearing. Hope for any kind of digestion was becoming lost. Even water passing through his body wasn't being properly processed. The nightmare continued to escalate on day 28 when doctors found myoglobin in Ouchi's blood. Myoglobin, also known as muscle hemoglobin, is released into the body when there's muscle tissue damage. Too much of it can cause complication in the kidneys, and with the deteriorating state of Ouchi's right arm, it was building up fast. By now, Ouchi was completely wrapped up in a special type of gauze to stop the hemorrhaging from his lack of skin. Fingers had to be wrapped up separately so they wouldn't stick together. It took a team of 10 people with very careful, specialized, sterile routines in order to change his bandages every day. Sedated most of the time, Ouchi's eyes had to be lubricated because they wouldn't close all the way, and they got so dry they started to bleed. By now, there was nowhere on Ouchi's body that could be touched, and we're only 29 days in. In the following weeks, the team worked hard to try to solve the rapidly disintegrating skin problem. Once again, Ouchi's sister came to his aid and offered up skin from her thigh that could be taken and cultured into more and grafted onto her brother. 70 pieces of grown skin were placed onto Ouchi's body, but because of the constant seeping fluids from his lack of skin, they became loose within a couple of days and never healed properly. 50 days after radiation exposure, more of Makawa's fears came to light when blood was found in Ouchi's stool. A fibroscope investigation discovered that his intestines were bleeding in various places and rapidly dissolving from the irreversible damage. Much like his skin, doctors were able to find evidence of regenerating intestine, but it was never enough to really make a difference. It was just evidence of his body fighting for its survival the best it could. Despite this inspiring thought and Ouchi's beating heart, this was the first time the thought crossed Makawa's mind. Is continuing treatment really the right thing to do? This moral dilemma was challenged again on day 59 when Ouchi went into cardiac arrest and his heart stopped for 49 minutes. The staff worked feverishly to try to bring him back, and after a few stops, his heart started to beat again. Now more of the staff were starting to wonder if this was really what Ouchi wanted. He was no longer seen as Mr. Ouchi to the staff, but more just a body they had to maintain, constantly pumping fluids into and replacing bandages for. Ouchi's family, on the other hand, never gave up hope that he could somehow pull through this. His father leaned in and whispered, "Stay strong until the end." By day 70, Ouchi's blood pressure was continuing to drop with his cell count, and it put his body into shock. Once again, the team was able to pull him back, forcing him to recover with a myriad of powerful medications. Day 81, Ouchi was relying on medication and machines for breathing, liver function, and blood pressure. His consciousness was non-existent. He experienced cardiac arrest. His skin was gone off his arms and front side. He'd been living as a husk of a person for weeks, and now it was finally enough. He'd stopped responding to the blood pressure machines, and Makawa knew it was time to stop this. He called the family into the waiting room and explained to them that the next time Ouchi's heart stopped, they shouldn't try to resuscitate him. Finally, the family agreed, and a do not resuscitate order was placed. After some final visits with his family at 11:21 p.m. on December 21st, 1999, Hisashi Ouchi's blood pressure fell and he passed away after living through 83 days of hell. Some would call this a relief, and others would say that they didn't do enough. But after radiation had destroyed a person's very chromosomes, doctors knew that there was nothing they could do. The treatment became, how do we cure him, to how do we keep up with his deterioration. Japan had never dealt with this kind of case before, and his physicians were flying blind, doing the best they could to keep him comfortable, as impossible as that was. Ouchi and his family were good people. They truly stayed by his side through the end, but I don't think he should have been forced to live through all that. As always, I appreciate your opinions in the comments below. Ouchi's colleague had a very similar but prolonged version of his story. Having received half the radiation Ouchi did, his skin also began to peel away, it just took much longer to do. Skin transplants were administered, and it looked as though it was going to work, but the skin that grew back had no elasticity, it was a lot like fabric. Soon it wouldn't matter, however, because his liver function also began to fail, and 211 days after the accident, he too succumbed to the radiation damage and passed away. He was conscious through it all. This story is a testament to how strong the human body can be, but we're left with a dilemma of, just because we can keep him alive throughout all this, should we really? Dragging out Ouchi's death feels more like torture to me, and I really hope that he wasn't conscious enough as his body deteriorated under him. Doctors have a duty to do everything they can, but to what extent, I wonder. Let me know what you would have done in their position. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to know my source for this video, I recommend the book A Slow Death, 83 Days of Radiation Sickness. It described day by day, step by step, everything that happened to Ouchi during his time with radiation sickness. For more oddities and true crime, as well as bad horror movie reviews, I hope you do consider subscribing, like the video, comment below. You can game with me on Twitch, you can follow me on Twitter, and as always, be well.